These are sourdough breads. Healthier, longer shelf life, and made with just 3 ingredients: water, flour, and salt. In this video, I will show you how to make them completely from scratch. No added yeast, no discard, and no waste. It's simpler than you think, and I documented every step day by day so you can follow along. I mentioned no added yeast, but we still need yeast for our bread. The only difference here is we are going to cultivate our own yeast using a starter. That sounds trickier than it actually is, so let's jump right in. We need a glass jar for the starter. I have this mason jar that's meant for a drinking glass, but it works perfectly. This next step isn't totally necessary, but if you love to track your recipes in a detailed way, you can use a kitchen scale. To make our starter, we need flour. Most flours will work, but I like to start with whole wheat. Whole wheat has a lot more nutrients than standard white flour, and it also has a lot of wild yeast already. That's going to make sure we get a big early boost. I'm starting with roughly 1 ounce of whole wheat flour. Again, you can eyeball this. Just start small because the amount of starter will rapidly increase. We also need roughly the same amount of water. I like using distilled water, especially early on for a strong start, but tap water will also work. I usually love giving exact measurements for recipes, but I think this is one thing where I prefer going by feel. Next, I'm going to combine the water and the flour in our container. I'll make a note of the day in the bottom left corner of the video so we can keep track of what's happening and when. Now, give that a good mix to hydrate the flour. Usually for a sourdough starter, you want a pancake-like consistency, like this. There are no hard and fast rules, but we'll get into the details in a bit more. The starter needs to breathe a little, but I don't want anything getting into it, so I'm going to cover it with a piece of paper towel to form a seal. It's still porous enough to allow air exchange. This is almost ready, but I think we should name our starter first. Giving it a name makes it more personal. Think about it like taking care of a baby. This will sit on my shelf at room temperature for a day. Usually on the second or third day, your starter will be extremely active. This has tripled its volume. That's good, but this early on, most of that activity is actually from bacteria and less so from the yeast we are trying to cultivate. We want the yeast to be the dominant microbe in our starter, and that's going to take a bit more time and feeding. If you give this a whiff, the smell will be slightly off, with hints of vinegar and a flat yeasty aroma. That's normal at this stage. Our starter is still young. The starter will also be a lot runnier than you left it. That's also fine. Just like on day 1, I'm going to feed the starter with about an ounce of flour. We could continue with whole wheat, but I'm switching to all-purpose flour. I just wanted all that nutrients and wild yeast early on. I'm going to eyeball the amount of water. I'm looking at the consistency of the starter as a guide to how much to add. I'm trying to keep this at a thick pancake batter consistency. Alright, cover that up and leave it at room temperature. We're still on day 2, but about 8 hours after the last feeding, I had a massive growth spurt. That's a great sign. So, let's give it another feeding. Even though the starter is very active, it's still very young, and I don't think a lot of that activity is coming from just yeast. This is called a no discard starter, where I feed my starter a small amount each time. This is great for people who don't bake a lot and don't have a ton of time. It's less maintenance and you don't throw away large amounts of flour. There's also a discard method that I'll get into a bit later, but for now, let's cover this and let it rest at room temperature. If you spot liquid separating from your starter, don't panic. That's called Hooch, and it's just a sign that it's hungry and needs to be fed. It's mostly water with a bit of alcohol, but it also contains lactic and acetic acid, which gives us those tangy sour vinegary notes. I'm mixing it back into my starter, but you can pour it off to reduce the acidity level. Just like with day 1 and 2, I'm going to feed this an ounce of flour. If this were the discard method, I'll be throwing out a portion of the starter before feeding it. It's a much more aggressive method, and it usually yields milder sourdough breads than the no discard method. The starter usually slows down on day 3 and 4. That's just a little bit of rise after a whole 24 hours. Sometimes you won't see any activity for a couple days. Don't panic, this is just the quiet phase. The starter is getting balanced. The bacteria that cause a lot of that early activity have started to die off, and the yeast and other microbes you actually want are just getting established. Just continue feeding as usual. You will start to notice more yeasty notes, with a smell that's a lot more pleasing than in the earlier days. Your biggest cause for concern is mold. I've seen where some people stir in white mold like this and continue feeding their starter with no apparent issues. Maybe it's fine, but if I get any molds, I discard it. As a general rule, if your starter develops anything colorful or fuzzy, toss it. Green, black, blue, orange, red, throw it out and sanitize your container. That is extremely active. Your starter is ready when it rises reliably after you feed it. I'm going to pour out my starter so I can clean my container. A mature starter will also smell fresh and tangy with a lot of yeasty notes. A no discard starter will usually be a lot more tangy because the acids build up from not discarding anything. You can also do a float test where you drop a bit of the starter in some water. If it floats, you're good to go. I've been spilling flour on this for close to a week, so it's nice to have it nice and clean for storage. I'm not doing any baking for a couple of days, so I'll be storing this in the fridge. The fridge slows down the starter a lot, so I'm going to give it a feed before putting it in. For short-term storage, you can keep your starter in the fridge and feed it once or twice a week, or whenever you remember. For longer-term storage, you can of course freeze your starter. It will last up to a year in the freezer, and when you're ready, just thaw it out and feed it until it's active again. For the longest storage, you can dry your starter and keep it in the fridge for up to 2 years or more. Once starters are mature, they are very robust. Sourdough starters can, in theory, live indefinitely, as long as they are fed periodically and kept from contamination. Each starter behaves slightly differently. I've made a few starters over the years and they all have slight flavor and aroma differences. Sourdough has a low barrier to entry and it's fairly easy to get into. But it's also very expansive, so if this is your thing, drop a comment. Teach us something. I made Easter bun earlier this year and a common request I got from those videos was to make sourdough Easter bun. That sounded incredibly interesting and I've never even heard of it before. But before I make sourdough Easter bun, I had to cover how to make a starter. We're not making Easter buns today, that's for a later video, but what I will show you is how to make a simple sourdough loaf. So, we're ready to bake. My starter has been in the fridge for a couple days and I haven't fed it. Now that I'm ready to bake, I'm going to get my starter active again. So, I'm taking a bit of the mother starter to build a more active culture. Start with about 2 tablespoons. To that little bit of starter, add about 4 tablespoons of flour. I'm using all-purpose, but this is totally up to preference. Next, add a splash of water to hydrate the flour and form that batter. I find that I do much better by just eyeballing this while looking for the right consistency. This should at least double in volume within a 4-hour period. If that doesn't happen, it's probably hungry. In that case, feed it until it reliably doubles within 3 to 6 hours at room temperature. I ended up feeding this one more time with the same amount of flour I used before. I'm done with the mother starter, so I'm going to place that back in the fridge until I'm ready to feed her again. As for my other starter, that will sit on the shelf until it at least doubles in 3 to 4 hours. As I mentioned earlier, the goal is to get consistent rise within a few hours. A very active starter will sometimes visibly bubble from all the trapped gases the yeast produce. It should look very alive. Alright, now that our starter is ready, let's make some bread. In a bowl, I'm starting with 1.5 cups of water. I'm not using precise measurements like in my other bread recipes. I'm just looking for signs that I'm on the right track. Next, grab your active starter and pour all of that into the bowl. If your starter floats on the water, that's another sign that it's fully active. You could add flour and water to this container with that small amount of starter and it will be just as active in a few hours. This is a dough whisk. It's exactly what the name suggests, and it makes handling the usual high hydration of sourdough much easier. I got it in a sourdough kit, and I'll of course leave a link in the description if you're interested. After a quick whisk, I'm going to add 3 cups of bread flour. Stronger flours with a higher protein content work great for sourdough, at least in my experience. All-purpose flour works too, but the microbes can quickly break down the gluten structure and weaken the dough, making it flat and soupy. This looks way too wet for me to handle, so I'm adding another cup of flour for a total of 4 cups. Give that a little mix, then add salt to taste. This is about a teaspoon, but I'm really going off feel for this one. Some bakers might include an extra step called an autolyse, where they mix just the flour and water and let it rest before adding the starter. It's supposed to improve texture and gluten development. I've had decent success without it, but it's something to consider. Once the dough is mostly hydrated and shaggy like this, I'm going to cover it and let it rest for 10 to 15 minutes. After that rest, I'll uncover it and do a couple stretch and folds. Wetting your hands makes handling sticky dough much easier. Stretch and folds help to build up that gluten structure so the bread can hold a nice shape. I'm going to repeat this about 3 times every 10 to 15 minutes until the dough smooths out and comes together. During this time, the dough is still fermenting, so keep that in mind when factoring in your bulk ferment time. Once the dough is nice and smooth, we're going to shape it. A little dusting of flour on your work surface will help with sticking. I'm going to roll the dough into a ball by folding it over onto itself, then flatten it out. Make sure the seam side is facing up. Fold over 2 of its sides, then roll it up, keeping everything tight as you go. Finally, roll it into a tight ball, keeping that shape nice and firm. This is a banneton. It's basically a basket for proofing dough. It came in the sourdough kit I got. I'm going to dust it generously with rice flour to prevent the dough from sticking. If you don't have rice flour, you don't have to go out and buy it. All you need is a little bit of rice from your pantry. Pop that in your blender and blend it until you get rice flour. It's that simple. Regular flour can also be used, but anyone who soaked their phone in water knows just how absorbent rice is. Next, place your dough into the banneton and seal the seams by crisscrossing tiny pieces of dough. This helps it keep its shape. Then dust the top with more rice flour. I'm going to cover this up and let it proof for about 2 hours at room temperature, or until it gets about 50 to 75% bigger. That will give me enough time to preheat the oven and get the baking equipment ready. Once that dough is done proofing, I'll grab a piece of grease paper. We place the seam side up earlier because when we flip out our dough, it will be right side up. That soupy consistency means I probably overproof this, but let's flip it out anyways. A little extra rice flour on top always helps. Next, I'm going to score the loaf. I got that dough raiser and the sourdough kit as well. Usually we score loaves to control how the bread rises and add our own fun designs. You'll notice that I'm having trouble scoring. That's one of the signs that your dough might be overproof and too slack. This usually goes in a preheated Dutch oven before baking, but I only have an appropriate stainless steel pan. Your grease paper should be big enough to lift the entire dough into the pot. Cover that and place it in the preheated oven at 450 degrees for around 20 minutes. Covering helps with a good oven spring by trapping steam inside the pot. After that, remove the cover and bake for another 20 to 25 minutes to get some color. This dough was overproof, so it's not as tight and robust as it should be. I got an okay rise and texture, but let's cool it and cut into it to see how we did. Wow, I like that, but those large air pockets on the top are a sign of overproofing. The flavor had an extra tangy kick from using a no discard starter and the overproofing, but I still really enjoyed it. I tested a couple loaves, proofing at room temperature and shortening the proof times, but I still ended up with a fair amount of overproofing. The biggest issue is that my kitchen temperature isn't controlled, so it can get really hot. That loaf is more like it. I got these results by making one simple change. Instead of proofing at room temperature, I proofed it in the fridge after shaping. The cold slows down all the microbial activity, so the ferment takes longer. I made the dough before bed, let it proof overnight, and in the morning I scored it and baked it straight out of the fridge. It scores a lot cleaner and deeper too because the dough is much firmer. Sourdough has a great texture and a much better shelf life than other breads while still maintaining that texture. This loaf has a darker color because I use a half and half mix of bread and whole wheat flour. The flavor is also crazy good, extremely complex for how few ingredients we use. Personally, I enjoy sourdough with richer foods like meat stews or cheese. That slight sour tang complements richness exceptionally well. Proofing in the fridge isn't necessary even with Jamaica's crazy high summer temperatures. That is it. These rolls were made by proofing at room temperature and I got beautiful results. I simply reduced the proof time and worked the dough a lot quicker. This was a decent intro to sourdough, but it barely scratches the surface of what there is to learn. Adjusting the consistency of your starter has a big impact on the final flavor of your loaf. There are lots of different flours out there to experiment with. You can really customize this bread to suit your taste by changing just a few things. So if you enjoy baking, make sure you work on that starter and add sourdough to your arsenal. If you want to see me cover something else sourdough, drop a comment below. I'm Nick and this has been delicious. Like the video if you got some value from it. Thank you for watching and bless up. Catch you in the next one.